in quite a long time. So just use the same format we do with our typical meeting minutes. Jeanette, Trudy, if you guys have any other advice there, please let me know, but we'll do things as usual, I guess. Again, thanks for making time on a Friday, everyone. 2:30 on a beautiful, beautiful day. I was chatting with someone who runs a school and then is also on council at a school, a different school. And she couldn't believe that they're sort of having applications due at the same time as regents and a whole host of other things in August as we get kick the year off. But here we are, and we're forging ahead, and we're in a good place. There was a bit of a snafu with regard to you guys getting some materials early in this process. The reason for that, we have discovered, we've been using a Board of Trustees group email. I have privileges there. Chris does as well. Alex does. Michelle does not. So when Michelle sent you a couple of notes early on in this process, you didn't receive them. We didn't catch that until a couple of days ago when Marion was like, hey, did you send that out? And I'm like, yeah, do you see this email? And so apologies for that, but we're going to make do. And I think we're in, again, strong footing. And we'll fix that so that Michelle now has privileges. So I think just stepping back for a moment, where are we? We're going in year 10, which is really exciting as a school. We did this the first time around, strong showing at the full 5-year renewal. I think as I think about where we are now and the feedback we received from our authorizer, other folks in the know, as well as just how we performed as a school, we're in stronger footing, significantly so, more so than we were the first time around. So that puts us in good footing. And so I think with this application, the job here is to do a good job with this. It doesn't have to be perfect. The work that we've done as a school with the opening of our high school, our graduations, the students and families we proudly serve, all that speaks for itself. So there are components of the application which will be more challenging as we move through this process over the course of the next 9 months. The revision for the downward expansion being one. That's largely going to be about maneuvering and gaining the favor of those who perhaps might be a challenge initially. We can talk more about that later on, but in terms of where we are now, we're in a good place. So what we're going to do today is we're going to acknowledge and discuss as necessary each element of what we're submitting. That includes the application, the various sections, each revision. As I said, Chris is taking minutes today. Michelle will share her screen. Alex will, as well as I will if need be. Michelle's going to kick things off and talk through briefly, walk you through each of the benchmark sections of our narrative before then moving on to the attachments. And we'll take this as we need to with regard to speed or depth. Michelle will kind of read the room and you guys will let her know what you want to dive into and what you feel good about, but we will honor each section. So Michelle, to you, and I guess you can share your screen.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for your time and attention and support of this process for our school. And as Josh said, apologies for the note not going through when we originally planned for it to, and thank you for leaning in this week once we rectified that. So I have up here the renewal application that you guys have access to. And so there's the narrative, there's attachments A through N, and then there's material revisions. So we're going to start right now with the overall narrative and then the attachments. So taking it from the top, there's the cover letter that is signed by Jim, and it's just a one-page overview of results. Does anybody have any questions or feedback there?
Jim's note in his email to me was that he thought it was excellent. The word he used.
I think I just have an overarching thing, and you guys know because I've sent you comments. I just haven't blasted them to the whole board. It's just, I think in the whole application, there just isn't much about the elementary school aspect of things. And I think we should walk through why that is and sort of where else it's addressed and whether or not, you know, just how that's going to play out. Because it's, like, I think of it as opening a new school. And when we opened the new school, starting, you know, 6 through 11 or whatever, 6 through 10 or whatever, for the first term, we had a whole lot of information about what we were going to do in the curriculum and how we were going to staff and like all that stuff. And it doesn't seem like we have anywhere near the same degree of information for the elementary school And so I don't know if that's not expected for some reason, or if we're going to provide that separately, or if they're going to look at the grant that we wrote, or, you know, what the answer is, or whether we should stuff it in there before Tuesday. But that's my main question, overarching question, I would say, about this whole animal.
Yeah. No, thanks, Maria. You're one of the best teammates we can have in this sort of process, where you come hard at kind of like feedback and do the good work beforehand. So I appreciate everything you've kind of brought. And I think with regard to the revision downward, I'll say two things. So I think one would be just process-wise. You know, this thing kicked off months ago with regard to like what we've been kind of like doing, who we've communicated with, et cetera. So you know, we brought on Simeon months ago to sort of help us as a consultant with this work, and he's seen this through on both sides of the arrangement here. And then we've had a number of webinars with our authorizer, as well as direct conversation with our authorizer on kind of like how to move forward with things. That isn't directly answering your question or statement, Marion, but it's just kind of saying a bit about process. Like there's been a whole lot of communication back and forth. And so we're not doing this kind of in isolation. And Michelle's really good about communicating when she needs an answer. So she's done that. I think with the narrative itself, we've tried to answer the prompts, and we tried to stick to what we did the first time around and just being successful this time around. And that was advice we were also given by our authorizer, like don't recreate the wheel. There aren't as many areas explicitly to address the downward expansion within the way in which the prompts are provided now, so we haven't done so. And then I think Simeon hasn't said, hey, you got to say more here. So we've kind of been going based on his guidance there too. In the revision section, we answer the prompts in the same way and provide answers to that which they're asking. And so we kind of like check the box with that. So I'm hearing kind of like maybe we should say more. And so maybe we dig into that when we get into the revision section to see if there are areas where specifically we can do that. But I think within the narrative section, there isn't like explicit space for us to address that. And if we did, we'd have to forego addressing some other area that they're asking us to. And Simeon really hasn't said, hey, you're not doing enough here if you want this. So that's been our approach and guidance thus far. And
Simeon is who? Like, what's his background? And
Simeon started, so I've known Simeon since 2010. Simeon Stoltzberg opened a school in the Berkshires in Massachusetts many years ago. He then began kind of consulting. I met him at the Charter Center. For you guys who've been around, he ran the Start Right program way back. Okay. And so he knows our original application. He knows us, and he's continued with consulting work. He's actually visited schools on SCD's behalf as a consultant and done reviews before. And so he's pretty much in the know. He's you know, he's done all, like, as I said earlier, he's done work on both sides of what it is we're sort of involving ourselves in with this application.
Okay. I mean, I hear everything you're saying. I still have no idea how the K-3 is going to work after reading the application. I have a teeny bit more of an idea after reading the amendments section, whatever that's called, but not a lot. So I don't know. I guess that we have an opportunity to supplement if they say, hey, there's not enough here, or how does that work once we submit?
Well, let's dig into that. I'm gonna say when we get into the budget of the downward expansion version of what we're submitting, I think we'll talk about the nitty gritty of the model a bit more. So let's kind of attack that head on when we get to that section.
Okay.
So Michelle, I'm gonna hand it back off to you. You were on the cover letter. I think I mentioned that Jim thought it was excellent. We move forward with any questions about the cover letter before moving on to benchmark 2, and maybe you can say a bit about why benchmark 1 is not here.
Yes. So just to underscore what Josh said in terms of revision requests and addressing the elementary expansion, that's not supposed to be addressed in this first narrative. It is in the revision request. And then there's a few select attachments where we're supposed to submit 2 versions of things, like one if this is approved and one if it's not, because we can't move forward with that until it's formally put before the Board of Regents. And so that is based on, as Josh had, conversations with Simeon and also with our liaisons at SCD and the guidance they put forth in the webinar. So it's not really present in this narrative application. That's correct. The cover letter, Jim said was good. And then as you can see, benchmark 1 is not here in the table of contents because that is about student learning data and test results, which are not available yet. And so we'll get those results within the next month and then submit that information for that benchmark in the middle of October is the deadline for that benchmark. Beyond that, teaching and learning is an overview of curriculum, instruction, and assessment across the middle and high school. Are there any folks who want to go ahead and dig into that benchmark there?
And for folks that provided some feedback on the document in the section, thank you for that, as well as many of the other sections here.
All right. And then benchmark 3 is on culture, climate, and family engagement. Things like our core values, classroom management practices, et cetera. Anybody who wants to dig into that topic?
And we're going to follow up with some of the attachments that go with each of these benchmarks. So you'll have a moment to also consider whether it's worth a discussion on any of those other attachments.
Moving through that first section is kind of really teaching and learning focused. And then we move into things that are more financial and the board with benchmarks 4 through 7. So first up is benchmark 4 is financial condition. Any concerns or considerations there?
I think there'll be some additional wording changes coming your way in addition to what Marianne may have just sent through, but nothing that we need to discuss, I don't think.
Okay.
Great.
I would congratulate Alex in drafting this. First time around, she's drafted a renewal document before, and I thank her for taking my feedback and incorporating it, as well as Simeon's and others.
Next up, benchmark 5 is financial management. Any other thoughts there? And then benchmark 6 is about the board. So it's about the board oversight and governance.
So I had one just question to refresh my memory. Do we have an active corrective action plan in place right now?
We do for middle school students who are classified as having disabilities based on ELA exam results as of 2019. And that is addressed in the application. Which section, Michelle, would that be in?
It's talked about in 6.
Yeah.
Okay. And then this, I think when you read the broader section.
Just to sort of also double back to that, I think due to not having exams and kind of like schooling being flipped around a little bit, there hasn't been as much dialogue coming from our authorizer as we had in 2019. So this is sort of lingering, but there hasn't been any direct communication with SED since this application about that action plan.
Okay. Yeah, I remember the first action plan we had. It was a big focus at every board meeting, and and then
But before we leave that on, shouldn't we just tackle that head on and like say we have it and we're dealing with it, or should we pretend it doesn't exist for purpose of the?
Oh, so do you mean in the application, or do you mean in the actions? It's there, and so we do acknowledge it fully and talk about the things that we're doing.
Okay.
In making that correction and having our students with disabilities in ELA in the middle school test more highly than they did in 2019.
Okay, I didn't remember that. Sorry.
It's addressed in benchmark 10 because it was a compliance piece.
Yep. And then more of an overarching substantive point. When you read benchmark 6, it sounds like the board drove the thinking and the process around expanding downward, which I think is misleading. And so I don't know if we need to just tweak the wording to say that it's been brought to the board and considered on some level, but
That's fair. Yeah. That's Michelle, you want to take notes on that just to get that flagged?
Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Janet.
So for context, we're going through this at Classical right now for one of the schools. We sent in a renewal application and got some feedback from Paulo about things that we didn't do that we were supposed to do.
This was last year you would have submitted and now you're getting feedback, or?
No, to be honest, I'm a little confused. I think we just submitted it a few weeks ago. It's like this online portal thing and you have to put one in each section and click and sign and everything, or is it? I'm a little confused. It feels different in this process, but it might just be because I'm the board chair there and I have to do different things.
Yeah, that would be one. And then the other would be but this is with SED, it's not with SUNY, it's the same authorizer?
Yeah, it's SED.
Huh.
And it's Palo. They might have just submitted early. Because I think they had the same due date. Maybe there were a bunch of things they said. We were like, oh, this policy, our lawyers reviewed it and this policy doesn't comply, and this policy doesn't comply, and this policy doesn't comply. And it's been like, I don't think it's a big deal. There's just sort of a little back and forth. They're like, can you go back in and change, make clear that your suspension, you can't suspend somebody unless, that kind of thing. Anyway, but one of the things was board contact information. I didn't see anything in here, but nor did I see a prompt in the question. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Again, I'm a little confused as to what's going on certainly at Classical and as well at Unity. So don't take too much of this comment, but just figured I'd flag it since I'm going through it in parallel process.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say less so at Unity, and that would have made us feel good.
No, I mean, I think my sense actually, to be honest, Unity's I only skimmed through this about a few weeks ago when you first sent it around, and I thought ours actually seemed like it was in better shape than Classical's for the most part.
It's much stronger now. And just to go, but seriously, to go back to what was the question you had, or the suggestion, Jake?
No, I guess the question was we were in the board and oversight question. And there, one of the things that Powell asked about is like, oh, you have to make sure you list contact information for all the board members and phone and email address. But on the other hand, I didn't see that in ours, but nor did I see a prompt for it. So I might just be being confused and it's already on our website and that's fine or something, but just figured I'd flag it.
It's included in attachment G. Attachment G has board names, email addresses, number of terms, etc. And so that's a specific attachment beyond the narrative.
And you bring up a good point process-wise, which is that we will expect to get some feedback from the authorizer about ways in which we kind of sharpen things, and I think that's part of the process, so that's okay.
Tough thing for a solving problem lawyer to hear.
It's like when you get comments from the SEC.
Yeah.
Palo sort of reminds me of what's his name, Gary Gensler.
Oh no, that's not good.
Just kidding around.
Back to you, Michelle.
All right. Are there any other comments about the board section? If not, we'll go ahead and move on to org capacity.
Headlines here, Michelle.
Yeah, so the organizational capacity section is about how we structure our leadership team, what professional development looks like, practices around hiring, retention of teachers, et cetera.
I mean, just as a general matter, I've sent you my comments. So
yeah. And then moving on from that, benchmark 8 is our mission and key design elements. Our mission is the same. Our key design elements, we'll be talking about a revision request there just to update some of the wording and particular programming that more accurately reflects what we do, but the substance of the 7 key design elements is the same. Any questions there? We will have more time to address that in the revision discussion in a moment. All right. Benchmark 9 is around enrollment, recruitment, and retention. This is one where the vast majority of the narrative is around subgroups, specifically students with disabilities, English language learners, and economically disadvantaged students. We are very strong in all three of in particularly students with disabilities and economically disadvantaged students in terms of having a higher representation than our district of location, District 13. We're about the same for English language learners. And that's a real positive for our narrative because SED wants to see that charters are serving a representative student body to the community. We are, as the board is aware, under-enrolled, and so we're addressing that kind of under-enrollment, even though it's not specifically asked about in the prompts. We wanted to make sure that we talked about it, as well as the strength that we have in subgroup representation. Is there anything that folks want to dig into there? I spent a little more time there because in the webinars, David Frank at SED said that benchmark 1 and benchmark 9 are the two that they really take the most time looking at in these applications.
So in addition to maybe trying to proactively address questions that may come up around enrollment, even though there isn't explicit prompts for enrollment of all students at the school, we do so then in this benchmark. And then we also try to proactively address just some data that's a bit flawed around retention. So just if you're interested in this stuff, and I think you are, we've got fairly strong retention across the school. If you look at the data 612, though, it doesn't necessarily show that when compared to peer groups. And the reason for that is we've got kind of a funky configuration as a 612 school where we have more students leaving in between middle school and high school, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So within this section, we did address that by excluding out that one single transition year and looking at retention in middle school and high school and drawing comparisons. And it shows a much more, I think, accurate and favorable retention rate versus other schools.
And is it sort of within the norm with that on that basis, or is it still lower than our peer groups?
No, it is higher, or it's significantly higher. It ranges or within 2 or 3 percentage points on the other end. And you can see that too. It's on, I'm not sure what page it's on, but it's somewhere on page 46.
And then the last benchmark is around legal compliance. And so this does have items such as addressing our corrective action plan. We did confirm with Paolo that is still open because we haven't had a second round of test scores since it was originally opened. So we haven't had an opportunity to formally close it because there hasn't been testing from the pandemic, as well as notes like teacher certification, things like that are in the last benchmark here.
Cool.
All right.
Move on to attachments.
Yeah. So then we have in the Google Drive folder attachments A through N. So we can kind of take it from the top here, and I'll note any of them that are open for revision because we'll be discussing those in the revision section as well. Attachment A shows draft school calendars both for this year and for 23-24. There's some requirements around instructional hours. I am planning to go back and make one minor edit to make sure that instructional hours are included on the calendar as well as our schedule. But it's fairly straightforward. Any questions on the calendar, or would folks like to review it here? Cool.
This, Michelle, you can kind of continue to go down the line. If people have questions, just shout them out. We don't have to pause if there are no questions, but just be proactive if you have something you want to bring up to the full group.
Sounds good. Attachment B is the school schedule. Very similar. Here's the schedule. Here's the instructional hours for both middle and high school for both this coming year and the year after that, 23-24. Attachment C is the complaint policy, which we do need to ask for a request for revision because SED has a new requirement. So we have to apply to revise our policy to align with their new requirements.
I sent you some comments on that, but that was 10 minutes before the call. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
You saw them.
I just saw it, but we haven't had time to incorporate yet, but we certainly can. It's a fairly, I think based on the quick skim, it looks like that'll be easy to incorporate. Attachment D is the discipline policy, which we're digging into more thoroughly. Thank you again, Jeanette and Marion, for taking the time to do that this week. And so we're taking feedback there to ensure that we're up to date on all policies, but we're applying for a request for revision to ensure that the documents that NICED has align to the policies in use at the school versus the ones from 5 years ago when we didn't have a fully formed high school, et cetera.
Yeah, and on that one, there's a lawyer certification in there, so we're furiously working our way through everything that we can. As everybody here knows, we're pro bono here, and this is not what we do every day, so we're studying it as best we can and giving all the edits that we can to ensure the best possible compliance. But this has been a bit of a stretch in a fairly compressed time frame.
Yeah, no, much appreciated here. And I think as I mentioned in my note to both you and Jeanette yesterday, I think another lawyer who we've worked with for very nuanced cases in the past before and has consulted with us, she's willing to kind of do a review on an annual basis moving forward to give us feedback. We feel like that's best, and I think that might be a good idea.
Sure.
I want to echo Josh's thanks. I'm sure that your schedules are extremely busy, so it's appreciated.
I'll add to that too, again, only to the extent that I see another school. I think despite Marion's qualifications of S&C's, expertise on all things charter school, I think you're in better shape than you think. And as a result, we are.
Attachment E will be digging into a little bit later with Alex and Josh. It's the budget. Attachment F is the bylaws and codes of ethics. There's no updates to that from 5 years ago. It's just fairly standard. Attachment G, I think is what Jake was referring to earlier. It's the Board of Trustees information, and it does have how long folks have been on the board, the number of terms, and email addresses. Attachment H is an organizational chart for both this year and this coming year and the year after that. That just shows reporting lines and how the leadership teams and teachers are structured. Attachment I is a paper that says we don't have a comprehensive service agreement, so we'll upload a PDF that says this is not applicable. Attachment J is our enrollment and admissions policy. This is another one where the language is boilerplate from 5 years ago. It hasn't updated, but we do need to apply for a request for revision, again, because SED has new requirements. So we need to apply for a revision to comply with their new language. Attachment K is proposed enrollment tables. I know that Josh has talked to you guys about this and shown it at places. This is also going to come up in the budget in terms of the assumptions that we're making about enrollment. And there are two versions of it. So one, if we don't have the expansion approved, and one if we do, because we need contingencies based on what the Board of Regents decision could be either way. Attachment L are our fire inspection.
Sorry, just on the enrollment, just remind me, this is obviously much different than our budget. That's because this is the max, not sort of the forecast.
Correct.
Okay. And so as long as we're within 15% of this overall, we're usually okay.
That's the threshold that SED has in place.
Okay.
And and I think what is problematic is when you go over that from like a authorized or political standpoint.
It seems like we did get a little bit of pushback of being when we were more than 50% below that, but I'm assuming that you've done the math and based on the 5-year budget, we're within 15%.
Within this, yeah, and yeah.
I think we've struggled this year and some recent years though on that 15%, so that could be something we hear about. Yeah,
which is why we then tried to proactively address it within benchmark. Was it 9? And so we've done so, and we've tried to get a decrease in that max enrollment in past years. We're not going to do that here within our revision requests. That could be something we think about down the line. So within this application, we're sticking with a max enrollment of 655, grades 6 through 12. And then with the revision, there's obviously a change in that max enrollment because we'd be serving additional kids and families.
All right. Picking back up the alphabet soup here, attachment L is the fire inspection certificate and the certificate of occupancy for our high school building. We don't need those for our middle school because they're co-located with a DOE building, but for the private space, we need those. Attachment M is a fiscal impact table that Alex put together. It's a fairly straightforward calculation just based on projected enrollment, what the fiscal impact will be for our district. And attachment N is a narrative outlining innovative aspects of our charter. It's essentially our key design elements and just why Unity is great in a one-page form instead of a 50-page form. So those are attachments A through N to go with benchmarks 2 through 10. Anything else there, Josh? Or I think that kind of brings us to a close for this section.
It does. So we've now reviewed the narrative and the attachments. We're going to move into the budget now within kind of like a steady state of continuing to serve grades 6 through 12. I sent you an email this morning with like some explanations. I'm going to kind of talk through those now. And then Alex, if you could share your screen with the 5-year budget, the Unity model, that first tab, that'd be helpful.
Josh, before we move on to the budget, what's the kind of final deadline for language tweaks for the narrative and the attachments, just so we have the big picture?
Michelle, you know what needs to happen with the portal and how much time that would take. What would you say?
My strong preference for feedback would be by the end of the day today. So that way I'm probably going to be looking at this over the weekend. If there's something that comes up after that, if you could just email Josh and I, so that way I can make sure to flag it and incorporate it before going live.
Okay.
Thank you.
But what else happens, right, after this? When are you planning to upload? Like, how do we get to the finish line from today?
Yeah, good question. I thought within the agenda today, I'd talk about that toward the end. We'll kind of run through things and then discuss next steps. Okay, so what you're looking at now, you're familiar with this template. What we have to do is take the data or budget within this template and move it into SED's template. You've seen SED's template if you looked at the expansion downward model. Well, we've done that directly. And so we're now in process. Actually, Alex has finished this, but we're going to look at our own internal sort of model that we've used to talk about the 5-year model that we're then submitting to SED as a part of our renewal application. So obviously our budget for this year is fixed, and our budget for this year, 22-23, counts toward this term, not the next term. So what we're submitting is our 5-year projected budget from 23-24 through 27-28. And so you approved the June budget. This budget is a direct extension, or the 5 years thereafter, this year is a direct extension of many of the assumptions that we made within this year's budget, given the information we have. As I said in my note, this is projected, and things will change within the model as information changes about what we know about school and how to best serve kids. So I'll note a couple of things that are key in driving much of what is here. We've maintained a conservative enrollment approximation over the course of the 5 years that now is embedded in our model for the coming year. That is fixed at 519. We are maintaining per pupil revenue increases of 3% each year moving forward. It's interesting, in looking at SED's template, it is required within their template that you include an annual increase of 3%. That's a part of the model that they provide. And so we've often talked about what the right estimate or prediction should be. And so, so that was kind of a new layer of information for me in looking at what they provide. Expenses are also maintained at 3%. So a 1-to-1 on what we're receiving state-wise, revenue-wise, and then what expense increases look like over the course of 5 years. You can, if you look down at the bottom of this model, if you've got it handy yourself, you'll see some of like the indicators of health that Jim put together some years back. And one of those is just compensation as a function of total revenues. And so those stay constant at between 77 and 79% over the next 5 years. And then facility costs also hold relatively constant between 9 and 11% over those 5 years. Those are like the big items here. And so I guess I'd ask if there are questions folks have about what what's presented.
I had it in my head, Josh, that the target for the comp was more like 75%. What Charter Center survey or some, is there some data point out there that that's more standard or?
Yeah, I would say this is a bit north of what the average school would be if we were to look at sort of data across the city. I think that is somewhat due to the model that we have and the way in which we've approached attracting people to our school. You know, one data point there is just we serve more students with disabilities than the average school in our district. And while we are provided with additional funding for that, it may not be one-to-one. And so we may spend a little more there than the average school that might have fewer students with disabilities or fewer students who are learning the English language for the first time. And so I think some of that is there. But I think that's fair. We go bare bones in a couple of other areas that we feel don't bear the same fruit as like just having good people. And so that's, I think, the idea behind why this percentage is it's a few points perhaps higher than maybe the average school in the city.
Okay, thanks.
Are there other questions here? Okay, so I think again, I'll just say it again. This is a projected budget, and you know, I think as we often do in our work together, we tend to revise this often when it makes sense to do so, and so things will change over time here. But as of today, this feels like a reasonable projection. I think with that, we're going to move back to revisions now. And we'll start with the non-material revisions. Each of these revisions has to be formally approved by the board before then submitting for applying for their approval with SED or with the Board of Regents in some cases. So Michelle, if you want to share your screen again, and we'll just maybe have available.
Do we need to say anything formally about the overall application, or do you want to do the renewals first?
Should we do that now?
Revisions first.
Let's do that at the end.
Okay, great. All right, so shifting gears into revisions. This is in the document, section 4, charter revisions. So we will start with the non-material revisions, which are a little bit less weighty, obviously, than the material one. So if we start out with the complaint policy, Marion, we will also incorporate the feedback that you just sent a little while ago, but the essence of this, apologies, trying to get to the right page. The essence of this non-material revision is to comply with new guidelines from SED that states that if folks have formal complaints that there's a violation of the law or the school's charter, that they can go directly to the board rather than school staff. And so the policy just needs to explicitly state that. And we're making a revision to make sure that our policy complies with that new requirement. Are there any questions about that update?
I think given that, I think we should approve these one at a time. And Jake, just from formality's sake, as sort of vice chair, do you want to call for a vote?
Sure, so called. And for what it's worth, these are one of the last one was one of the ones that we got in trouble for at classical, so they will check.
So I think in this case, all right, everyone has cameras off who's now voting, and so just to take stock, all in favor? Looks to be unanimous. Back to you, Michelle.
All right, great. So next up is our enrollment and admissions policy. This is another one where we need to submit a revision to comply with new guidance from SED, including that we state the date, time, and place of the lottery in accordance with this law, section 104, and that it will comply with this particular section of the commissioner's regulations. So the update just reflects that new language. Are there any questions regarding that update?
Great.
Okay.
Jake, you want to bring this to a vote?
So moved. So everybody, give us a vote. All in favor, hands up. All opposed, hands up. I see unanimity.
Great. Our next non-material revision is around our key design elements in benchmark 8. Any update to the wording of our mission or key design elements requires a formal request for a revision. This is a non-material revision because the overarching 7 categories, the substance of them is staying the same. What's reflected in here is changes to offer updates based on the past 5 years of operation. So for example, things like a positive and supportive school culture in the text of the key design element in the original one that NYSED has on file is predominantly about, yes, youth empowerment seminar and a mentoring core, as opposed to programs that we have in place to support a positive school culture, including our positive behavior supports and interventions tiers, advisory, et cetera. So this is just about updating it to make sure that the things that we have in place to support this key design element are accurately captured. Our enrichment courses have expanded from world languages and cultures to design and technology. So updates around those things. The text of the updates are here with updates in red. It's not a formal red line where it's crossed out the old things, but the updates are marked here. And Simeon had said that that was sufficient for our purposes here. Any questions around this revision request?
Back to you, Jake.
Another vote. All in favor, please raise your hands. Let's see. Do I see everybody? Is anybody else keeping track of this? I should have asked that.
Yeah, Chris is taking notes here.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I see everybody's hands up. Anybody opposed? Okay.
All right, Michelle, maybe we go to the last material change. Is that right? Or were we? Okay, sorry.
One more non-material revision.
Mm-hmm.
So our last non-material revision is around the student discipline policy. And there's 2 kind of layers to this revision. One is similar to the complaint policy and the lottery policy to comply with the new requirement from SED. The new requirement in the discipline policy is something that we have done in the past, in that if a student has needed a manifestation determination review and their conduct is attributable to their disability, then they return to school rather than serving the rest of their period of suspension. The school has done that in practice, but the policy needs to explicitly state it. So we wanted to make sure that we incorporated that language into the policy. The second and larger, more substantive piece of this is that we wanted to reflect updates made over the past 5 years based on our experience with kids and families, and also thinking about our commitment to equity and inclusion. And so some of those include updates to our uniform policy, our cell phone policy. We've shifted the core values and behavioral expectations in a student-facing way. So shifting from our original 6 core values to pride, and from 3 Bs to claws to kind of allied to being a panther now that we have a school mascot. Substantively, the tiers of infractions are aligned to the New York City Department of Education rather than creating the tiers that we had created in-house. So that was just for clarity's sake. And we've also eliminated detention as a consequence, except for tardiness. So it's no longer for things like talking in the halls, and Saturday reflection is not a potential consequence as well. And so those are there. We are very much still working to incorporate the feedback from, and this one is the one attachment that requires legal certification. So as we mentioned before, we are working to incorporate the feedback from both Marion and Jeanette, who have taken a look at this for us to make sure that we are in compliance. And so I believe that we'd be asking for the revision, presupposing that we incorporate that feedback and it's to everybody's specifications. Josh, anything else that you want to add there?
No, I'd ask Marion and Jeanette if that makes sense to you all.
Jeanette, you're on mute.
I was saying, I think that makes sense. We'll approve subject to incorporating the comments.
All right. And Chris, that's for the minutes.
Got it.
Okay. Jake, if you want to bring things to a vote.
Sure. Another vote on the last set of policies. All in favor? Hands up. I think we just need Sal. Sorry, Sal. All right, we got him. Any opposed? Measure passes. It's a good practice for my future.
So that covers.
It's going to be lonely at the top, man.
That covers the non-material revisions. And then the material charter revision is obviously much more substantial, which would be expanding our grades and enrollment from 612 to ultimately K-12 in this next version, K-3 and 612. Josh, would you like me to talk through this, or do you want to take it to start here?
Why don't I start and then I'm going to kick it back to you and then you're going to kick it back to me. Sound good?
Cool.
All right. So I'm going to do this. I want to take a step back for a moment in terms of like what this is and the motivation behind this proposal. And I think we've discussed this on and off informally over time. And I think it probably deserves more conversation over the coming months. And so we will be doing that August, September, whatever's needed in kind of making a really sound decision here. But I think at this point in time, we feel good about what this could mean for school and the kids and families we serve. So this is a slide that we used in July and then back in June, and I borrowed from other prior meeting slides and kind of incorporating and putting together this proposal to expand downward and serve kids in elementary school. So I think just the motivations I want to reiterate, and then some of the strengths and perhaps challenges. So I think motivation wise, with this expansion downward where we begin serving kids in kindergarten as of the year 24-25, we'd be able to serve kids earlier in their education, and in doing so, perhaps be able to have them more academically prepared than they otherwise would be in working with us during that time as of 6th grade. From a relationships and collaboration standpoint with families, obviously being able to work with families for a longer duration of time, build stronger connection, trust, that's all good for kids. And so this is another advantage of shifting and expanding our services downward. It would also kind of eliminate for us something that we've been challenged by, which is a competitive disadvantage by not having an elementary school that feeds into us, which is the case with many of the middle schools that are also in our area that we compete with in gaining the attention of families and having them enroll in our school. So we spend a lot of time and effort right now in doing that work. And so with an elementary school feeding directly into our middle school, I believe that we'd be able to reallocate some of the efforts and resources that we put forward right now with recruitment and put it toward things perhaps that are more directly influential to student learning in our classrooms and their academic success, both at Unity and beyond. So those are the key motivations I see that make this really promising and exciting for our school going into year 10 this year. With this, strengths-wise, we've got in feedback from our families, there have been numerous moments in which families have asked about why we haven't done this sort of thing earlier on in opening an elementary school and serving some of our families' younger kids. So we've got the backing of families based on that communication, that back and forth. We've had community leaders who've also expressed support for our interests here. Our authorizer has given us the green light and says, hey, if this is what you think you ought to do and you think it's good for school, then you should go about doing it. And so that is new as of this past year and is encouraging. And then we've got this grant, which is not something we've had before, and being able to do this as well. Resources do matter in opening a school. And so we've got some funding from SED to do this if given the permission by the Board of Regents to do so. So these are all just good additional hints or indicators of this being a good move for the school. In terms of challenges, just naming them, politically, I think it seems to be in the city that there are less approvals for new schools or perhaps expansions going on. And so this would be an effort for us to sort of convince those making decisions that this is a really good opportunity for the community that we serve. And so
on that point, Josh, it's not a new charter though.
It's not. It's an expansion of. It's an amendment. It's a revision to our charter, which is technically what we're doing here, and it just means that instead of us serving students 6-12, we'd be serving students K-12.
So at least politically, it doesn't mean getting into that whole.
That is correct. So it's not as challenging as trying to open a new school, which can't really happen in the city or state right now because of a cap, I believe. I've kept up with every political aspect of charters, but it's much more difficult than, say, an expansion upward or downward. And there have been a number of schools in our area recently who have gotten permission to expand upward. I'm thinking of 2 middle schools recently that were given that approval by the Board of Regents.
And
So
Josh, just a quick question, which I think I know the answer to, but you guys wouldn't go into pre-K, right? This is it?
I don't believe that we're able to do that within kind of like
I think it would be a Department of Health, right? I think it's just a completely different process, but
that's correct.
That's not, it's sort of not under consideration, right?
It's not, no. So I think with that, I'm going to kick it back to Michelle. If there's anything within what we're submitting formally that we want to address, we can do so.
Sorry, and being the real estate guy, I have to throw another challenge on the list, which is, I think, finding the real estate, I think, will be a challenge too. Given our last experience. I don't think this, and unless you think the city's gonna give us public space, my presumption is that they're not, and then we'll have to find private space.
Yeah. And I think so we could apply to open in 23-24. And I think for some of the reasons mentioned here, taking this more slowly is the right move. And so within our proposal that we're submitting, we would open in 24-25, which, if given the green light by the Board of Regents in the spring, would give us 1.5 years, again, with that funding to do the work well, to do the prep work well.
Just so I understand, so like let's say that happens and we can't find a space and time, there's no penalty for not opening, is there?
There have been schools that have not opened that, from like a authorization standpoint, have not been penalized. It's not a great look because you're like recruiting families and things and getting people fired up, and then you're saying like no. But that happened to a school down the street 2 years ago, and they're opening this fall instead of last year. But they had to tell their families in like June that it wasn't going to happen. They were serving a middle school. They were a middle school and serving 8th graders, and so those 8th graders had to find a different high school. So that's what we want to avoid.
So I think as we continue this conversation going forward, I think getting that whole like sort of timeline schedule will be helpful, at least for me. To say, like, okay, do we recruit the families and then sign the lease, or do we look for the space and then start recruiting the order of operations?
Okay.
So kicking it back to the text of the charter revision that we're proposing, this would be an expansion cap. This is drafted, so that the subheadings are what SED requires in any request for a revision that impacts the enrollment camp or grade expansion, which they consider to be kind of one and the same. They consider those to be the same sort of request. As Josh said, this is the enrollment table that is also in attachment K that shows exactly what we just talked about, that next fall, a year from now, would still be a planning year with kids joining us in the fall of 2024. I did also correspond with our grant representative, also at NICED, but a different part of NICED. And the funding for the grant goes through June 30th, 2024. So we can have this delay and utilize the funding during that timeline for planning with this without losing that grant funding, which gives us some more time to plan, to go much more in depth on things like curriculum planning, to do things like hire school leaders and recruitment and figure out space, all of those things.
Can you give a little more detail on that? So you have to use the funding before you actually open, the way it actually works?
It's an expansion grant. So the purpose of the grant is to help schools do that work and prepare and launch their expanding grade levels.
If you fail to open, do you like have to pay it back?
I'll have to follow up with that question. I'm not sure.
I would have to ask the grant representative in there. I don't recall anything in the request for proposal about that. The language was all around that the funding is contingent upon approval from the Board of Regents. So
Yeah.
we can't access the funding until the Board of Regents approves this request for expansion.
Okay, but just to be clear, that you can't use it to pay your expenses in your opening year, right? Like the period for spending it will have passed by the time you actually have kids in the building. Okay.
Yep.
Correct. And I think the theory is that then you'll have per pupil funding. So to pay for these kindergartners, you'll get funding to pay for them. The planning doesn't have funding for it. So this supports that planning and prep work.
Okay.
Apologies, I have to hop for 3:30. I think we have quorum without me, but I wanted to flag.
Thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think with that, it's a good reminder of time. So we should kind of continue forward. So I think with that, maybe we move to are there any other questions? We're going to talk about the model a bit more within the budget, but are there other questions about what's being proposed here?
I mean, my only request is like when we consider material changes to what we do, who we serve, all that, I think we should, and maybe there won't be any more, but we should come to the board a little bit. Consider going to the board early when things like that are in the offing.
Sure. Let's move into, Alex, would you mind sharing your screen for the expansion downward budget?
Do we want to have a motion to approve this, or do we want to talk
Let's get through the budget and then we'll approve, because that's an important component. Okay, so this is using SED's template. And so it's set up a bit differently, but what's nice about this template is in column N, you can see all of the assumptions spelled out pretty cleanly. And so I'm going to talk about a few of them today, but this is what we will be submitting if all seems right within this call. You'll see in row 19 that 3% per pupil revenue increase is set and not something we can change. And so I'll just note that, as I said earlier in this call. This is also projected. And so this is the information we have now at hand. We'll be digging into this more deeply as time goes on. This would be 2 years away at this point in time. And so there's heavier planning to do, but we feel pretty good about kind of like the broad strokes of what this school would look like in serving K-5. A lot of the assumptions from our steady state budget apply here. The big difference is that we're serving more students, which requires a bit more. And that also then allows for kind of some additional funding to then serve those students. So it ties in at the same rough proportions as our current model. Just from a simplicity standpoint, much of the change is driven by student population. And carrying over those same proportions of revenues and or costs. So you'll see an enrollment of 75 per grade. That the rationale there is essentially that elementary schools tend to be smaller than middle schools and high schools by cohort. This would be roughly a little bit bigger than maybe like the average elementary school in our area in central Brooklyn. But certainly not as large as our middle school was when it opened in comparison to other middle schools. So it's somewhere around the middle. It allows for 3 different sections at 25 apiece to be served in the school starting in year 1 moving forward. And we increase by 1 grade level at a time. And so by the end of this 5-year term, we would be serving K4 and 612. And then we'd apply for renewal in that 5th year, and we would grow to full scale the year after that.
Can you spend 1 minute, Josh, on how you get to 25 as the right class size?
Well, yeah, I guess what I'd say here is that the other aspect of elementary schools, it's a little different than a lot of middle schools and high schools, although we do have a majority of our classes which are co-taught, even at the high school, is that in elementary school, there are typically 2 teachers in a classroom, and we would follow that best practice at our school too. And so the ratio is still rather small. In that 25 kids, my son's school down the street has about 30 students. He's in the 4th grade, and they have either 1 teacher, in some classes 2 teachers. And so for us, we value kids having as much attention as possible. And so we're looking to kind of maximize that out. And so a 12-to-1 ratio in a class seems about right, given our experiences and then what we see in the literature and among other schools.
Do you have anybody in the Unity leadership team who has experience with what you call it? I guess
Elementary school?
Elementary school, yeah, K through 3.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Melissa has some heavy experience in elementary school, and she's kind of jazzed by this whole notion in working, perhaps being able to interact with young kids. So I kind of place her maybe at the head of the list, and then beyond that, a lot of parents right now who have kids in elementary school, which is very different than when we opened, where we were a bunch of young people without kids.
And then just, I guess, on the class size, I guess I would encourage you to go more towards the median of elementary schools rather than somewhere between the Unity middle school size and an elementary median. Just again, on the assumption that we don't know what we don't know about elementary school, and that there's some reason why people have clustered around a smaller average class size.
Yeah, no, I agree with that right now. I think if there was movement beyond the 75, I think the movement probably should be less or fewer. And so I think as we get more information, that will be something that we can change, and that would then influence perhaps our staffing in some regard too. So in addition to the 75, I already talked about kind of co-taught classes, and so that's embedded in the model when looking at staffing. If you want to scroll down somewhat, Alex, folks can get a sense of the way in which this model is built out. And so we are assuming kind of 3% inflation or increases in annual costs with regard to compensation, which is what we do in our steady state budget, in addition to having obviously more staff or more teachers hired on as we serve more grades and more students. So that's reflected in the model too. Right now, and this is a bit of an open question, we are assuming here a facility reimbursement from the city in line with the reimbursement that we receive for a high school facility. And so there would be some work involved in kind of like making that happen and go through. And so that's what's built in this model as of now. And I think, as I said
How much,
earlier, yep.
how much space do you think you need for a K through 5 school?
I would say less space per student than what we have at the high school.
But do you, like, I guess, what do you like to get? I know later on you've got a rent number in there of like 500,000.
Mhm.
Is that like, what do you, how did you get to that five? Aside from it being a round number, is there like a rent per square foot you're thinking, or is that, or too detailed to what you're?
Yeah, I think that's probably, I mean, I think it there's no formula kind of embedded right there. I think we kind of looked at, we're going to grow from one grade moving forward. We have a sense of what we pay now for the high school and the square footage there. And so I think when we did this, when we were looking at private space originally, one of the questions that came up is, do you pay for all the space in that first year, or you work something out with the landlord where there's some kind of compromise, something in the middle? And so I think within our calculations here, we thought that the 500,000 was a round number within that first year. And there's more work to do in getting something more refined and nuanced, but we felt like that would suffice, at least for right now, and seeing the degree to which this 5-year model works out. We're open to any other suggestions you have, though, because I think this was something that Alex and I talked about actually yesterday.
So I guess altogether there's 300 new students in the
75 per grade.
But like I said, at full capacity, that
300, so it'd be yeah, so just over 300. 375.
Well, but in K through 3, you'd be at 300, right?
Yeah. So it would actually be 6 grades counting kindergarten. So 6 times 75.
I'm just looking at the top, the top where it says total paid student enrollment. It goes from 519 to 819. Is that am I not thinking about it right?
No, that's right, because by that year you have kindergarten grade. So
Yeah,
kindergarten,
I
first,
think
second, third. Yeah, you're
right.
good.
By 27, 28, your highest grade is still third, so you've got four cohorts.
Oh, I see. You don't have the full school.
You don't have the full, so you're at 300 at that point, and then you'll get at 375 the year after, and 450 the year after that, right? If I have
I'm just doing math as to what 500,000 is on 375 students. So that's $1,300 a student. What's our current rent? Do you know? I don't know offhand. The current rent's like $1.5 million. That sounds about right. $1.5 million on 500-ish, 519. Let's see what that is. So you're really, I think you might be low on the rent based on I think we're currently paying about $2,800 a student, and you're basically saying the elementary school will be a little less than half of that if it's at 500,000, unless I'm doing my math wrong.
So what would be the recommendation here?
I guess I have no idea, but absent knowing anything further, I'd probably just take the same, whatever you're paying on a rent per student basis on the high school, and assume it's going to be roughly similar for the lower school. Just, I mean, I think you're right that in an ideal version, you probably don't need quite as much space, but it's not like we're working on a blank canvas of schools around the city and sort of assume we're going to end up somewhere similar.
Alex, that makes sense to you?
It does. How do we want to account? I mean, we're talking about doubling it, right? So then we're going to be in a situation of a net loss. So we'll just have to, because we wouldn't be eligible for reimbursement for the full rent in those first couple of years because we wouldn't be at capacity. So we'd have.
You could assume just for now that you get to ramp. Maybe you get 3 years to ramp up or something like that of the rents, so that at least you get that'll close a little bit of loss. I don't know. You might still be. It's going to change the overall economics because your costs are going up. Oh, and I guess your subsidy will hopefully cover the difference. So it might just be a short-term loss. And I might have been wrong in my calculation. So just double, I would just basically extrapolate whatever you're paying on a per high school student and assuming you're gonna pay something similar on a per elementary school student.
Alex, any clarifying questions there?
No, I just want to be clear. Are we proposing putting forth a budget with an operating loss? Or are we going to go back and extract out additional expenses to offset the increase in real estate? Because I don't.
We would do the latter. It's just a question of what those decisions are. And I think there is more buffer in this model than there is with our steady state, as we kind of just experience some economies of scale.
Is there still, Josh, in the existing model for the high school, any social distancing built in, or is that?
It's an interesting question. CDC came out with new guidelines yesterday, and then there were some guidelines coming out from someone from Chan last week. So we're kind of internally talking about much of that, but we don't see there being nearly the concern this year that we had coming back last year.
No, and I agree with that, but I was just wondering if there was any sort of extra we could cut due to the fact that we didn't have to do that anymore and we could enroll more or whatever. And so when we think of that in terms of, is it apples to oranges or not, is there any room to say, well, I can be a little more dense with my toddlers than, or my young kids than my high schoolers, but I don't know, right?
Yeah. So I think what we'll do is, Jake, we'll try to embed in your recommendation here, and then I think in the event that it seems tight, I think it's okay to assume that like the space does not need to be identical for an 8-year-old versus a 16-year-old.
I mean, presumably there's guidance out there, right?
Yeah.
So let's do something that's reasonable. I agree with Jake that if we don't have better guidance, we should use the same numbers. I think if you had a good reason to say, hey, all the literature out there says a 5-year-old needs 20% less space than a 12-year-old, then fine.
Yeah, just I guess keep in mind that what you always said about the high school is that it's too small relative to the number of students we have, and that's why we're going to expand without adding a similar number of new students. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So we will make a couple of amendments there, but the idea here being that, like, in the end, we want to reflect a budget that is healthy given what we know right now.
And then and maybe this also helps address Alex's question, but is there? I didn't see anything budgeted like for capital, for like the one-time capital of building. Like in the high school, we ended up having to spend like $1 million or $1.5 million of FOMB to furnish and to fit out and furnish the school. It's probably reasonable to assume something similar for the elementary school.
They don't ask for capital.
Okay.
They don't ask for the capital budget in this template.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure why they don't, but that's why that piece is not in this presentation.
Okay, so you could also think about the shortfall as a capital expense that like you fund the operating shortfall when you're ramping a new operation up.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to then kind of assume this, at least as of now. Okay. So are there any other, in addition to what we talked about with the budget and then with this material revision, are there any other sorts of comments? I think there's been some good information shared overall. Are there any other clarifying questions or ideas that we should put forward before then bringing this to a vote today?
Can I just ask a really silly question? In column N, like around 9:10, it says completion of this section is mandatory, and there's a typo in mandatory. I don't know if it's
That's nice. That's
the
typo. They,
authorizers or.
I was just looking at that too.
yeah, they spelled superintendent wrong in another section and
Okay, all right, I'm gonna.
yeah. Yep.
It's rich.
So I guess we've got two things to bring to a vote now. One would be this revision and then the application.
Should I call a vote?
Yeah.
Me stepping Jim around. All in favor? I guess I'll take them in turn. First, the revision. All in favor? Great. I think we got 5 yeses. And then the application for renewal, to be more specific. All in favor? All right, carries the day.
Okay. Michelle, did we cross all our T's and dot our I's with regard to this session today?
I believe that we did. We will need a couple of things for submission into the portal that Jake was alluding to. For all of the revisions, we will need board meeting minutes reflecting this vote, as well as signed board resolutions on letterhead that are reflecting these approvals for the 5 revisions. So I guess one question is who's compiling those, what the process is for putting those resolutions together?
Chris and I will do that.
Yeah.
And Jen or Maureen, if you want to look over that, or Trudy, if you want to look over that all beforehand, we're happy to kind of share, but we're also okay moving forward with it.
I
Happy to
mean,
look
if
at
you
it.
have, yeah, well, we can probably look, or if you have whatever you did 5 years ago, it's probably fairly similar what you need, right?
And then that's for the revisions, and then for the application itself, it requires sign off from Jim or an authorized signatory for both the cover letter as well as the application for renewal, where you need to type in a few different things within the portal and then a space to sign within.
And we're set up to get that to happen. Is Jim gonna be in a position to do it?
Yeah, and so he's checking email here and there when he can, and so I'll be in touch with him this weekend to sort of fill that, make that happen.
Okay, great.
Looks like he has to sign manually. Is that the?
You don't. Once you go in the portal, there's actually a way in which you can do it electronically. We were looking at that last night with the same question and perhaps concern.
It's pretty easy.
Jake, can you confirm if that's the case, that you can do that e-signature in the portal without any issues?
Yeah, you just use the mouse and
Could we
I find it to be
authorize,
really challenging, actually.
could we
The
authorize?
motor skills
somebody-
aren't there.
Could we authorize somebody as a backup? Like Jake, would you be willing to sign as an authorized signatory if for some reason Jim can't do it?
no.
That
I
makes
mean, I'm
sense.
putting my name on the line for all of this hard work. Yeah, sure.
Well, we won't tell Jim.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the backup.
All right, that's a good call. Okay, I think that's all today. Then I guess we'll be in touch with
I
Maria,
did have,
Jeanette.
oh, sorry,
Mhm.
one more question. Jake, was there anything else that you learned from classical that you would like to tell us before Tuesday so that we could incorporate it? Just felt like now is kind of an opportune time to know.
No, I mean, I guess the short answer is no. I think you guys are pretty, from at least my experience at classical, you guys seem to be pretty buttoned up. And yeah, I told you, like, I think if there are any problems, it seems like Paolo just reaches out and says, oh, the lawyers reviewed this and you need to do X, Y, and Z. And then again, for what it's worth, I asked Paolo, like, where does X, Y, and Z come from? And he didn't respond. So he referenced some ed law in his original note, but
Okay, everyone, this was a thriller of a meeting today. I appreciate folks making additional time. I can't believe it's now Friday at almost 4. So I hope you have really wonderful plans today and this weekend, and we'll circle back with the right parties over the coming days. Thank you
Josh
so
and
much.
Michelle, can I steal you for 2 seconds?
Yeah, let's do it. Can't wait.
It won't take long, I promise.
All right.
All right, sounds
Take
good.
care,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Take care, Trudy.